Welcome to Rio de Janeiro, where the roughly built favelas of the working class overlook multi-million-dollar stadiums built for the world's rich. With the approach of the World Cup, people from around the globe have been looking towards the struggle here in Brazil. May 15th was a nationwide day of action against the Cup, with protests in major cities around the country. Waves of protests against the Cup have been happening throughout Brazil. These have been important confrontations, with militant youth, students, teachers, and workers coming together against the government. Actions like the occupation of land near Sao Paulo by the homeless workers movement and the confrontation between indigenous protesters and the police in Brasilia. Yet despite attention being drawn to these latest protests, a far more important and far-reaching process has been emerging in Brazil ever since June. The short memory of the international media has led to the focus only re-emerging now with the World Cup. But these protests have been part of a broader process that started in 2013 with the mass movement unleashed by bus fare hikes. This has led to the development of a movement with a significance and a power vastly greater than any street protest or confrontation, the emergence of a conscious and combative working class. This is not merely a matter of the number of strikes unfolding in Brazil right now, but the quality of the movements behind these strikes, the fundamental changes in consciousness which underlie them, the popular mood which makes their victories possible, and the foundation it lays for future advances. To describe this, it's necessary to start with the huge protests 1 year ago in June. Mass marches of hundreds of thousands, millions throughout Brazil, were sparked by the proposed hike in bus fares. It started with protests of thousands, which were met with sharp police repression. In response, more came out to the streets, and the protest over the fare hike became the spark around which protests of hundreds of thousands mobilized around the country. This was, of course, an incredibly mixed movement, as is any initial entrance of the masses into history. It was united by specific demands around transportation, a vague anti-corruption platform, middle-class influence, some right-wing co-optation, and everything developed within a context of brutal police repression. Towards the end of June, the government announced it would roll back the fare hikes, and as with any movement as broad as the movement of June, while people's political consciousness was often radicalized or advanced, in general, the movement lacked a concrete direction. There was talk of a general strike to be organized by the trade unions in early July, something which could have given an immediate and powerful focus to the sentiment created by the new wave of protests. However, at the last minute, the leadership of the bus unions withdrew, leading to it being nothing more than a march of left and labor forces. However, the political radicalization engendered by the movement made itself felt in the teachers' union, which was preparing a strike that became the center point for the movement. The pay and working conditions for teachers here are abysmal, and they are often forced to work 2 or 3 jobs in the private sector alongside the public classes they teach. Schools are overcrowded and falling apart. Demands around more money for education have been one of the central and broadly supported goals counterposed against the huge expenditures for the World Cup. The teachers' strike was huge. There would be mass assemblies of hundreds to vote on the direction of the strike. Marches of thousands and tens of thousands, smaller than the previous mass movement, of course, but also more political and more militant. Intense police attacks would follow, with professors often beaten in the streets. In this context, the Black Bloc emerged as a qualitatively different force. Whereas before June it had mostly been composed of white middle-class students, it was now appearing in force as the immediate choice of militant youth, poor, working class, black and brown, who were rejecting the reformist politics of the official left. The Black Bloc intervened in confrontations with the police, defending teachers, rescuing them in many cases from police attacks, and launching attacks of their own. They won enough support among teachers that militant rank-and-file members of the teachers' union pushed through a resolution declaring the union's unconditional support for the Black Bloc against the police. Yet despite large protests in the streets, the unions didn't achieve a significant victory or advance. There would be a march in the streets, the police would eventually launch tear gas and repress the protests, everyone would go home, and a few days later the same thing would happen again. There was popular support, but nothing to force the government to come to a better agreement. The union leadership, dominated by left bureaucrats, rather than looking for ways to escalate the labor struggle, instead pushed through a controversial end to the strike, which was a return to the status quo. There was a lull in the movement here. Whereas the teachers' strike revealed a potential strength of the Black Bloc at a particular moment in relation to the labor movement, It also revealed the weakness of the tactic. In the absence of protests driven by the labor movement, there was nothing to go to. No protest in which to engage in fights with the police. Without any strategy to intervene in the labor movement, any approach to workers' organization, there was no way to make more radical or advanced protests take place. The Black Bloc disappeared, and it has only begun to reappear again in the opening created by a new teachers' union strike and new workers' struggles. Eventually, the government succeeded in reintroducing the fare hike without provoking mass protests. This was a clear demonstration that even the power of millions in the streets isn't enough to secure long-term victories. The government can agree to a few demands and wait for things to die down before reintroducing the same austerity measures. Only real power, power growing out of positions in the workplace and out of the ability to shut down the country's economic system, can force the elite to make substantial concessions. One of the most significant struggles was a Wildcat strike of transportation workers in Porto Alegre, one which lasted 15 days and despite being illegal was able to win a small victory. It was only a few more percentage points in the wage rate, but as a movement it was one of the first and clearest examples of the most substantial political development to come out of the struggle here. A militant, fighting section of the working class, organized from the base, bowing to neither union bureaucrats nor the government, and taking militant action on its own initiative. It was the beginning of the development of a vanguard of the working class.
Então é o seguinte, estamos ainda, pessoal, engasgados com a situação da greve. Consideramos uma vitória a questão do fim do banco de horas, a questão da união da categoria, a questão da mobilização e outras coisas mais. Mas a gente está, sim, pessoal, já se programando, organizando uma operação padrão que vai se estender até a Copa e na Copa para geral. E aí a gente vai cantar aquele versinho que a gente cantava lá, que dizia assim, ó, ô, rodoviário parou! Rodoviário parou, rodoviário parou, rodoviário parou, rodoviário parou, rodoviário parou.
Strikes overall were becoming more common since June, with militant, often illegal struggles breaking out across the country alongside bureaucratically directed ones forced to the left by rank-and-file pressure. The turning point for all of Brazil, however, came here in Rio de Janeiro, in the middle of Carnival, with the heroic strike of the street sweepers of Rio de Janeiro. The street sweepers, or garis, are one of the most proletarian and most exploited sectors of the Brazilian working class. They work all day cleaning up the city's trash and earn a miserable salary, one which before the strike was around $400, barely enough to scrape by in Brazil's most expensive city. Workers, taking independent action and self-organizing democratically, rejected their bureaucratic union which was presenting the usual set of gains barely above the official rate of inflation. They also demonstrated a clear and uncompromising sense of class consciousness.
São movimentos de uma categoria proletária, trabalhista. Quem se levantou foi o trabalho. Dentro da prefeitura, a categoria mais humilde proletária é o garimpo. É o proletário vivo no século XXI. Ainda. Eu fico, como eu posso dizer, lisonjeado com a situação que eu me lembro as épocas da França, quando teve os manifestos comunistas, os proletários que se rebelaram, se revoltaram contra a situação. Então, o Gari está ciente do que aconteceu lá na França, nas épocas antigas. E hoje, aquele povo que estava na França, aquele povo reviveu o trabalhador que não aceitou aquele jugo de escravidão. Esse é o movimento do proletário.
Porque a escravidão não acabou nesse Brasil. E ainda continua. Ela agora está globalizada, é o preto, branco, louro, moreno, mameluco, todos nós somos escravos. Então nós temos que vir para a rua e batermos de frente, convocar todas as classes operárias, nos unirmos, nos unificarmos, apoiar todos os companheiros que estão brigando, seja no Brasil, na Argentina, no Uruguai, Paraguai, qualquer país. E nós vamos continuar com esse apoio também a todas as classes trabalhadoras. A gente reforçar essa corrente, manter essa união, para nós derrubarmos essa quadrilha que tenta nos mantermos no açoite da chibata.
Strike committees were organized from the base, with recallable delegates and a class struggle approach. The union worked with the local government to declare the strike illegal, but the strike continued. Hundreds and then nearly 1,000 workers were threatened with being fired, but the strike still continued. Workers had one huge advantage. The strike was carried out during Carnival, when workers would have the greatest potential bargaining power and the whole world would be forced to see trash accumulate in the streets of Rio. Everywhere the marches of the Garis passed, people showed overwhelming support for their struggle. Finally, they won. They won with a 40% wage increase alongside improved holiday pay, better meal tickets, and other benefits. The importance of this strike can't be overstated. It's the most important event for the Brazilian workers' movement in years. An illegal, Wildcat strike, organized outside the union by rank-and-file workers against both a private company and the municipal government, goes on to win the biggest victory in recent history. With the example of their victory, new and mostly victorious strikes emerged among Garis in Niterói, Sao Paulo, Recife, around the country. The victory was both symptomatic of and the greatest expression of a new wave of advanced workers' struggles. Millions of people protested in the streets and changed everything about the political discourse, but tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions in the streets could not by themselves secure any real victories. The bus fare hikes that sparked the protests of June were soon re-implemented when the crowds went away. However, thousands of workers, stopping production and striking illegally, were able to win one of the biggest victories in recent Brazilian history. This process did not end with the strike of the Garis in March. There are more strikes going on right now in Rio, not to mention the whole of Brazil, than I could possibly mention or have an adequate knowledge of. One of the most important, however, one of the most potentially powerful, has been that of the rodoviários, the transportation workers, including bus drivers and the people who collect the fare. This is one that is ongoing here in Rio and also in Sao Paulo. Just recently, the subway workers, or metroviários of Sao Paulo, began their own indefinite strike, and metro workers here in Rio de Janeiro are considering going on strike soon. Alongside this, teachers' unions have gone on strike again and led some large protests. But when the teachers go on strike, the schools shut down and maybe a few streets will be closed by a march. When the bus drivers here go on strike, the entire city shuts down. The economy simply ceases to function. Workers are willing to experiment with new militant tactics. In Sao Paulo, the bus drivers left their buses parked blocking the street to help maintain the picket. Here in Rio de Janeiro, bus drivers have been considering letting passengers ride for free as a strike tactic. Whether or not this or that idea is implemented or effective, fundamentally there is a new surge of creativity, a new wave of ambition and audacity coming from the working class as it seeks new methods of struggle. Now, it is vital to mention that this movement, this development of a militant, fighting, working-class vanguard, has not been simple. It's full of contradictions. There are people in the Garis proposing dual unionism as a response to the betrayal of the main union. You have workers who are being repressed by the police, but are still overall pro-police. You have a group of workers, in particular the rodoviários here in Rio, who are fiercely militant, but will sing the national anthem at the end of the meeting. You have a march where the union leadership basically discouraged the bus workers from joining the march that was being held by the teachers' union against the World Cup, on the basis that it's a separate struggle, that the union doesn't have anything to do with. Yet these mistakes, however painful some of them may be, and whatever new forms of struggle will be discovered and implemented from the base, these will be the victories and defeats of a class coming to act as a class for itself. When I was participating in one of the recent marches and assemblies of the transportation workers, I was marching alongside also many Garis who came out to support the movement. One of them, my friend Claudio, was saying next to me in a seminar on the importance of working-class feminism held at the State University here. What is happening here is the development of a real vanguard of workers. The World Cup has played a part in both sparking resistance to the brutalities committed in its name and also in providing an opportunity during which workers have tremendous opportunities to shut down production and transportation. Workers are no longer settling for the deals that just keep pace with inflation. With the example of the Garis, workers are going out and demanding 30% or 40% pay raises and are demanding the improvement of working conditions. Workers are also reaching out to join other struggles of the working class. They are self-organizing strikes democratically from the base, with workers' assemblies deciding the direction of the struggles instead of, and often against, the union bureaucracy. There are likely to be defeats. There are likely to be costly mistakes and hard-learned lessons. The state is organized to attack and try to break these strikes, with the full force of the police and even the army. The organized left is completely inadequate to the huge task of keeping pace with and working to unite these new explosions of workers' militants. Yet what is going on here is fundamentally a completely new level of the workers' movement, unhindered by faith in the union bureaucracy or the reformist parties the bureaucracy is linked to. This is the movement which is confronting the World Cup, and more importantly, which is starting to shake the political and economic order which brought the World Cup into being. Everywhere in Brazil, and particularly here in Rio de Janeiro, workers, the unemployed, the impoverished are confronting huge increases in the cost of living, are being evicted from their homes, are having their lives submerged under a process of gentrification and capital accumulation. Resistance has emerged in the streets, has taken off violently against the injustice committed in the favelas, and has produced widespread disillusionment with the reformist promises of the government. Most importantly, however, the Brazilian working class is forming as a subject of history. Workers are coming together on a militant, democratic basis. They are resisting both the state and the bureaucracy. They are willing to fight illegally and willing to win. The potential of this movement goes far beyond the demands around the World Cup, and it will continue long after June and July.